Well, we're sort of picking up where we left off. We said that we would be working on the restoration of the Delton fire wagon, but just to get everybody caught up, in 1985, Delton Locomotive Works started making brass engines.
Well, they're sure a pretty engine.
They made 7 different locomotives, and they've been referred to as the Magnificent Seven, and they did as many as like 24 variations on some of those engines. But in 1985, one of the very first things they did was this fire wagon. That's a little off subject.
A little bit, yes.
It's not a locomotive, and they only made 5 of these. And it's just something that they wanted to do and something they never did again. This is what it looked like when it was brand new.
That is really nice.
And it was in Lenny Sloboda's collection. And I always wanted one of these.
I can't blame you, they're neat.
But, and I love all Delton locomotives and everything. And even though this was kind of off of their normal subject, if you will, I just thought they were really cool. And oddly enough, Lenny Sloboda's exact model came up on eBay.
Yes, I noticed that one day.
And it was a dealer selling it, and he had gotten hold of the entire of that collection, put it up on eBay, and I contacted him and said, I want it. And there it was. So this is what I thought we were buying.
Right.
But when it arrived, turns out this is what we bought.
Oh, I was so disappointed looking in there.
It was just packed wrong and destroyed in shipping. And I mean destroyed, really broken up badly. But I wanted one of these so bad, I told the seller, I am going to repair it. And set out on the great adventure of restoring this thing. Well, first up, let's talk about the horses. Now, I want to replace all of the glue joints here and solder everything. And it's difficult soldering to anything like a big chunk of metal like this. It's just very difficult to transfer heat into such a big piece of metal to get the solder to flow. And again, just to get everybody caught up, the horse on the right there is one that I bought several years ago when it came up on eBay. One of these models came up that was completely disassembled.
How fun.
And it also included, for whatever reason and however that happened, the original pattern model from Delton.
Oh.
The one they made the molds off of. And the horse on the right here is one that they made and never used, never finished, and it was just in with all these parts that I bought. But it's intriguing because it actually shows you the process of how these things were made.
Right.
It looks like it's got plaster crusted on it.
Right.
Well, what they did is they sculpted the horse or made the parts for the fire wagon or whatever, and then they made rubber molds off of those and then injected wax into the rubber molds, and then they added sprues to the wax and took the whole thing and put it in an investment, cristobalite. It looks like plaster. And then they bake the whole thing in an oven at 2,000 degrees.
Oh my.
And that just vaporizes the wax, and it heats the cristobalite up to cherry red. And at that point, they can pour brass into the mold. And when they throw the whole thing in a bucket of water, the cristobalite all vanishes. It just explodes because it's so hot, and what's left is a brass horse.
You fish in the water and find your horse.
Now, it's really interesting that we have this one horse that, for whatever reason, was never used on one of the finished models. For one thing, you can see that it's still crusted over with the plaster-like cristobalite that was used for casting the brass. And it has all of these weird knobs all over it, which are places where wax rods were attached to the original wax casting of the horse before it was invested in cristobalite, and those formed channels for the molten brass to flow into the mold to create the horse. Of course, all of these would have to be cut off and those areas cleaned up if this were to be used as a horse on a finished model. Now, they actually did some work on this before discarding it. They've drilled the hooves here so that they can place brass pins in there for mounting it to the wooden base. They've also drilled some very fine holes here and fed brass wire through there. This is where the reins attach to the bit in the horse's mouth, and then they've also drilled and placed another ring up here where a leather strap connects to the chain rigging, which connects to the wagon itself.
So I wonder why this was never finished.
Well, I'm wondering if they finished all 5 models.
Oh,
Because not only do we have this unfinished horse, we have a completely unfinished fire wagon
right.
that's only partially assembled. And so I'm just not sure that they made all 5. But it's great that we have this one unfinished horse because it actually helps me to figure out how the 6 horses that go with the fire wagon actually go together.
Right.
All 6 horses are completely unique. They're in different positions. While they were wax, it was very easy to move the legs and the heads around, putting them into different positions before they were cast into brass. Moreover, there's actually 2 completely different horses here. So there's 3 of each style horse, and then each horse has been repositioned slightly. So they have to go back exactly where they came from, or it's just not going to work.
Well, I'm glad it's you figuring this out. For me, it'd be like a gigantic puzzle.
Part of what makes it tricky is the thing is pinned to the base. The hooves have been drilled and brass pins put in there, and then all of these pins have been slightly bent when the whole thing broke apart. So the pins have to be straightened and so that they align perfectly with the holes in the base. Moreover, you can see that there's actually 2 complete sets of holes here. So they must have positioned the thing on the base and then for whatever reason decided to reposition everything. Now, all I have to go by to tell me which horses go where is this original photograph from the eBay listing, and because the horses are in slightly different positions, I have to figure out which one on the table here is which one in the photograph. Once I had that little jigsaw puzzle figured out, I took a piece of blue painter tape and put that on each horse with a description of what position that horse goes in on the base. Because I need to have all of these things off of the base while I'm painting the base and while I'm doing some of the repairs on the horses.
I think it would be easier to point out what doesn't need to be repaired than what does need to be repaired.
Now the fire wagon itself is mounted to the base with a great big Allen screw that comes in from the bottom. So I went in with an Allen wrench and simply backed that screw out, and here again you can see that it was drilled twice. So I can see that only one of those holes was ever used. The other one isn't quite large enough for the screw. So for some reason the holes in the base were originally in the wrong position and had to be redone. There's some minor damage here on the fire wagon, some parts that broke off while everything was on the loose. Fortunately, I have this other fire wagon, the partially completed fire wagon that I bought some years ago, and it acts as a guide to help me figure out what goes where. Now there's some strange tarnish in places here, and I thought maybe that was from solder flux or something, but after I started really working with this, I realized that it was glue, that some of the parts had been glued on, and this is dried super glue or something, but it's whatever glue they use to attach these parts that kind of spread out across the model and has turned white. But you can see down here where the glue joint actually broke, there was just a very small section where the 2 pieces of metal had come together and a little tiny glue joint, so it's no wonder it broke loose. Anyway, I'm going to try to avoid using any glue here and instead solder everything in place so that in theory it won't come loose again. So this is my solder of choice for doing this kind of work. It's a silver solder as opposed to a lead tin solder. It melts at a little higher temperature, and I'll use both solders for different purposes, but if I'm working on like a brass engine or something, I prefer to at least start with silver solder.
Radio Shack, are you serious? How long have you had that solder?
Well, I've had the reel a long time. I keep refilling it.
Oh, who wants to get rid of Radio Shack? But somebody did.
It's pure nostalgia.
Yeah.
Now, these are some of the tools I need for soldering. Those are my spare tips.
Oh.
My soldering, well, they wear out, and rather than continuing to use a bad tip, I'll just replace them because it's critical to have a proper tip on the soldering iron.
Oh, it sure is.
And then I've got my brass wire brush, which is somewhat worn out here, and a solder removing tool, the blue thing there, for sucking out solder. Now, sometimes you're just not going to be able to move enough heat into the model with a soldering iron unless you're willing to sit there all month with the tip against the item. So sometimes using a torch is the only way you're going to get a clean soldering iron. So we use this little propane torch for all kinds of things here around the shop. And then we've got this insulated pad here. I don't know what it's made out of, but you can solder things directly on top of this with the torch or the soldering iron without burning up your bench. So let's start by just making a little test connection here with a couple of brass tubes. I start by putting the flux that you use with the silver solder, and you can see you just want to work a little drop. Everywhere that flux goes, the solder is going to go. It'll follow that flux around. Then I'm going to use the Weller soldering iron here, and I've got the temperature turned all the way up because silver solder melts at a somewhat higher temperature. Now it's important that the joint that you're making is all clean. In this case it's brand new brass tubes, so they really don't need to be cleaned up. But I am going to clean up the tip here on a wet sponge because it's important that even the tip of the soldering iron is free of any oxidation and nice and clean. Now I'm going to hold the soldering iron against the joint that I'm trying to make, and you can see that I'm also starting by getting a little tiny bit of solder going because that'll really help transfer the heat. Once you get a little bead of liquid solder, liquid transfers temperature a heck of a lot more than just the contact of the tip against the item. So once the solder starts to flow, you can see it really starts to go, and the tip is readily transferring its heat into the brass. So I've got an incredibly strong solder joint here, a little teeny bit more solder than I need, but it's a good strong joint and I'm happy with it. Now let's try doing kind of the same thing, only with the torch. I'm going to fill the torch from the main propane bottle here. That's the way this little guy works, is you fill this, and I pretty much fill it every time I'm going to use it, and then it has an electric start, and then it has a little key here that'll lock it in place, and that way you can set this aside on the bench. Be careful not to burn the GoPro camera here. And then I can set this on the bench, and that allows me to hold the work right in front of the flame, as you can see. And it very rapidly heats the material up, and that solder liquefies, and I can now pull that joint apart, or in this case, push it together and hide some of that excess solder. And needless to say, that's a very, very strong joint at this point. But if I need to unsolder this, I can do the exact same thing in reverse. Hold this up until the heat transfers into the tubes, and then I can pull them apart. And at that point you'll see that there's really good transfer of solder onto the brass, so that was a really, really strong joint. Okay, now let's see if I can solder one of these connections on the spare horse, if you will, just as a practice thing to see if I can get solder to flow down in there around the bit in the horse's mouth, which currently is just pinned in there with nothing holding it in place other than the fact that it's pinned. So I'm going to start by cleaning up the area to the best of my ability. If I really wanted to do this well, I'd get Karen to put this in her ultrasonic cleaning tank for a while. But I think if I just brush some of this cristobalite off of here and bring it down to where the metal is nice and shiny, I can apply a drop of flux here, and hopefully I can transfer enough heat into that huge casting of that horse to get solder to flow. And I know this is going to really be a challenge because of the size of that horse and the amount of heat that's just going to be flowing out into the horse, and the way the heat's going to be pulled away from my joint. So I'm not even going to try doing this with the soldering iron. I'm just going to go straight in with the torch. Now here again, I've tried to get a little bead of solder to liquefy here, because if that solder liquefies, it'll help transfer heat into the casting. But the casting is pulling away so much heat that the little bead of solder is just sitting there solid, even directly under the torch, because the heat is all being pulled away by the large casting. I've also got a little more solder on there than I'd like to have. If it would ever liquefy, I could go in with my unsoldering tool and suck some of that solder out of there. But right now it's just a bead stuck to the surface of the horse, and it's not liquefying or doing a darn thing because of the size of the casting. Now right now this is just practice, but on this horse I actually need to go in and repair some damage at the nose of the horse where the bit got pulled free in the wreckage. And you can see here what I've done is rebuilt the whole bit area and built that up with a little bit of solder, because I've got the bit and the leather harness and the chain that goes down to the rigging. And so my plan here is to repair all of this damage and then solder everything in place so that it doesn't come back apart.
Why does that remind me of my last trip to the dentist?
Yeah, straight from the horse's mouth.
Oh, no kidding.
I had so much trouble with this because it's so hard to solder to heavy chunks like this, and I was using the torch and I was kind of muttering under my breath.
Oh yeah.
And but I got it done.
Yeah, you got it.
I finally got it to a condition that I actually rather like.
Just like my dentist did with my tooth.
Now several parts had come loose from the fire wagon itself, and over here I've soldered this little hose saddle in place, and I'm happy with the solder joint. But look at this mess over here. I think these parts were either re-glued after they fell off or at the very beginning, but this is not a solder joint, this is a glue joint, and it's also something of a mess. So my plan is to use the torch and break loose that glue and then re-solder this connection so it doesn't look such a mess. But there's some really great solder joints here. This is a solder joint, and you'd never in a million years guess it. And over here is a solder joint. Now these have been touched up with some gold paint so that you can't see the actual solder. Over here they haven't really touched it up well, and you can see that this whole plate has been discolored by heating it with a torch. But where this disc mounts on there, that whole thing there is a solder joint. But for whatever reason, some of these parts were glued on with something that resembles an epoxy or something. And so I want to break all of this mess out of here and then redo it as a proper solder joint so that it looks quite nice. That's a much better looking joint there. Once I got all the parts mounted back on the fire wagon and that looking good, I needed to remount it to the base because I can't position any of the horses until the wagon is properly screwed in place. When I was test fitting the horses to see which went where, I realized I had no idea how any of this rigging worked, how the harnesses hooked up or anything. So I got online and found photographs of old fire wagons, and also some of the members of the channel commented and explained how some of this rigging works. So I love these old pictures.
We have been on just a tangent this last while with researching old pictures.
Yeah. All kinds of different things. You've been researching your hometown.
Yes, there's so much about it I know and other things I don't.
But it's just, sometimes doing the research is the absolute funnest part. And when I found this picture, I realized this is the exact wagon that they duplicated. Everything about this is exactly like the model, so this must be the prototype. And I'm even wondering if they followed this photo. The only thing that's different is this only has one row of 3 horses. And actually one of the members on the channel commented and said they never ever would have used a second row of horses. It just never would have worked.
Well, I wonder if they didn't do that just because of a dramatic effect. You know how artists can be when they change things up a bit.
Yeah, I think they just thought a second row of horses would look neat.
I think it looks better, to be honest.
So this strap here is reproduced in the model, and that goes down to a length of chain, and then the chain connects over to this crossbar, which is part of the wagon. So all 3 rear horses have this strap on both sides of the horses. The straps are still there, although they're damaged, so that will have to be repaired and rebuilt. Then there are these finer straps that hook directly to the bit, and those go all the way back to the teamster. And there's kind of a rig here where all of these straps are hooked together so that only 2 straps come back to the teamster. So even though they've added a second row of horses here, I'm just going to sort of freelance. I can kind of figure out how they had it originally, but they're bringing all of those straps back to just 2 straps, and then those 2 straps are in the hands of the fireman slash teamster running the wagon. And you can see here in this picture that that's how they would do that. There's only 2 straps that come back to the teamster from the 3 horses, or in this case the 6 horses. Now, in trying to figure out how this had been originally done on the model, I could kind of figure that out, but what I couldn't figure out is how to do all these straps. There just wasn't enough material there. So what I ended up doing was cutting out new straps out of thin brass on our paper cutter. We've got one of those school type paper cutters, and it's great for that. Now the first thing I'm going to fix are the chains. The wagon is connected to the harnesses by short lengths of chain, and some of these chains have been broken and some of the pieces are just missing. So I've got some silver chain on hand, which is the right size, and then I'm going to have to fashion new links to hook the whole thing together. I'm going to make the links out of this brass rod. It's the same gauge that they used on the original wagon, and I just need to be able to bend it up into little loops like this, and I'm going to do that with these. These are wire bending pliers that are designed just for making loops. These are offered by Katie for bending the little magnetic rods on Katie couplers, but they're also available just as wire bending pliers. You can use these pliers to simply pinch the end of a wire, and that will bend it into a loop shape, and you can even make compound loops, as you see here, compound bends. And then because the pliers themselves get larger and smaller as it travels up and down the end of the pliers, you can use that for making larger and smaller loops. So what I do is I pinch off most of a loop with the pliers and then feed that around through the part on the wagon, and then I can go in with needle nose pliers and close it off the rest of the way, and then cut that off with wire cutters. And then in places where I need to replace whole sections of chain, I can add in a little short section of my silver chain, and then that's connected at either end with loops that I've made with my Katie wire bending pliers. In some places, all I need to do is add 1 or 2 links to repair the broken chain. It becomes easy to see where I've put in new chain because it's a different color, but my plan is to come back here with some paint and just color in this chain so that it all matches. Now some of these chains attach to the leather straps that come down from the horse collar, and so in that case I have to fish a loop through the strap here and create a new chain that connects the strap from the horse harness all the way down to the rigging on the wagon. Now the two horses on the rear row, the horses on the outside, have this very fine chain going down to the wagon tongue, and I can't fashion little teeny loops like that, but those chains were originally just fished through the loops here on the tongue and then connected together in the middle, and that connection has been broken. So I have to recreate that connection between those two very fine chains. So what I need to do is find some super fine brass wire and fish that through the ends of the two chains and tie those back together that way. So once I got all of the rigging to the wagon from the rear row of horses in place, I was ready to move on to the front row of 3 horses, which hook up in a very similar way, but they connect to this long board that sits between the 2 rows of horses. So while the rigging is going to be slightly different than the rear horses, the process is going to be exactly the same, and that's bend little wire loops with my fine brass wire with my wire bending pliers and use those new links to connect replacement bits of chain to that long wood section that runs between the 2 rows of horses. And then simply repeat that process for all 3 horses here on the front row of horses. I'm trying to make it look like the horses are actually pulling against that rigging, that there's tension there, and that's pulling on the leather straps, but that's kind of difficult to do. You have to hold everything in place while fishing the wires through the chain and try to pull everything up tight. Once I've got the chain rigging all finished, hooking all 6 horses up to the wagon, I'm ready to move on to the reins. And the reins run from all 6 horses up to the hands of the fireman teamster, and they're connected at different places, forming this kind of webbing that goes back to the teamster. And on the original model, these were crimped, but I want to solder them all. And so what I'm doing is taking all of those original connections, building it back exactly the way it was, but instead of just crimping one strap over the top of another, I'm soldering everything into place, which is fairly simple to do with this fine metal. It's just difficult to get everything into position and then clamp it so that I can then come back and solder these connections. The solder looks a little bit of a mess, the bright silver on the strap, so my plan was always to come back and paint these joints with a paint. And rather than use like a gold paint, which wouldn't match at all, I'm using a tan paint that's approximately the color of the brass, the tarnished brass. As always, whenever I can, I'm trying to use a lacquer, Tamiya color acrylic lacquers, and they're also available as Mr. Color. It's the exact same paint and the exact same bottle, just a different label on there. But this is my favorite paint, especially on metal. I have the hardest time working with the water-soluble acrylics. I prefer a lacquer, an acrylic lacquer. Anyway, there it is with all the brass repaired.
Right.
We'll have to pick up next week fixing the diorama and the paint job. There's a lot of things here still to fix, but it's really nice to see all of the brass work, the rigging, the harnesses, everything back to original condition.
Right. You can almost go, phew, yeah, you know.
Well, if you're not a member of the channel, you might want to consider clicking the join button, and that would push $5 a month our way, but boy, it sure would be appreciated. But if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please click on the upcoming subscribe button. That doesn't cost a darn thing. And then you'll be notified when we upload the next video. So the totally easy way to subscribe is by clicking the blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday as we mess around with some electrics.
Oh boy.
See you then.
We'll see ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.